Welcome everyone to today's session in the Export Skills program. Today, of course, we continue our module on standards and certification, and we're looking today at the importance of standards certification and indeed their place in global value chains. I'm Collins Rex. I'm a director of the Global Trade Professionals Alliance, and GTPA is an organisation that cultivates international standards within the industry, so we certainly know a thing or two about them. The aim is to create a trade environment that is both inclusive and trusted by all. And the GTPA has partnered with Global Victoria to deliver this comprehensive export skills program. For details of the full program and to register for other workshops, be they webinars like this one or face-to-face, please go to the address on your screen, and do bear in mind that you do need to register for every single session you wish to attend. You can't just register overall and then be registered automatically for everything. You have to select the individual sessions, or else your registration will not be picked up. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, which for me is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I extend my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us online today. So as I mentioned, I am Collins Rex, and I'll be your presenter for this particular seminar. So standards, certification and global value chains. Now, in our introductory session last week, we looked at what standards are, how you basically get certified, etc. We set the scene, if you will. And today we're going to look in more detail at why it is that you would want to be certified, why it is that you would want to be applying standards, and the way that standards interact essentially with the broader trade environment. So we're going to be looking at standards as a gateway to global markets, choosing the right standard or indeed standards for your business. We'll be talking about multinational corporations and how standards play to them. Also standards in the World Trade Organization Agreement on technical barriers to trade. And as always, any questions that you have, please type them in the chat box. If the question is relevant to the conversation of the moment, I'll take it as I go through. If not, we'll hold it until the end. But don't forget to type them in, so type them as you think of them. So standards as a gateway to global markets. Why is it that you would put yourself through the ringer, if that's the way you like to look at it, to get yourself certified and comply with certain standards? Well, basically, to gain market access overseas, Victorian and Australian products, processes and services must often be designed and certified to meet international standards. There are certain products and services that if you do not have certification, you will not be allowed to sell them in certain markets overseas. And the same applies to goods that come into Australia. Certain standards have to be met, and they have to be proven to be met for many goods and services to enter Australia. Alignment to international standards also support consistency and interoperability across borders. Now, that quite simply means that from one country to another, we understand each other at a fundamental level. We understand that goods and services have met certain standards, which means we understand that goods are safe, that goods have been processed in the correct way, etc. We also understand that certain standards around things like anti-slavery and so forth have been met. Sustainability of timber, for example, very important that those standards are met, or else you won't be able to import that timber into Australia. It also means that Australian businesses, irrespective of their size, can take their place in global value and supply chains without having to put the burden of proof on them from a really onerous perspective, because the standard essentially speaks on their behalf. Implementing a national or an international standard will almost certainly improve your business. But of course, in order to really capitalize on the benefits that accrue to you as a result of applying standards, you will need to be certified, and more about that later. So when we look at standards in the context of international trade, international standards that are created through the ISO and the IEC play a vital role in facilitating trade. They allow Australian businesses to compete successfully on what is essentially as close as can be to an even playing field. Now, Australian industry, of course, is faced with an increasingly challenging and competitive international landscape. And this is defined by geopolitical and also technological change. Using international standards allows us to meet internationally recognized benchmarks, making it easier to compete and sell anywhere in the world. And that definitely gives you, as an Australian business, a competitive edge. Now, very often the question arises about where standards are applicable. And I regularly get the question from SMEs to say, look, I'm a really small business. I can't afford to get ISO 9001 certification, for example. It's really onerous. It's complicated to get. It can be expensive. Do standards still apply to me? Well, they absolutely do apply. It really doesn't matter what size of business you have. And a question that's just come up, and it's relevant to what we're talking about right now, so I'll take it now. Henry asks, is it cheaper to get certification from an overseas third party? In Australia, we can get NATA endorsed companies to certify our process. Why should I get certification in Australia rather than seek overseas? You can seek overseas certification. You just have to make sure that the body that you choose to certify you is accredited. So if it's ISO accredited and or IEC accredited, there's a very good chance that Standards Australia will also accept that accreditation. It doesn't have to be accredited in Australia, but it does need to be an accredited body to make sure that it's reputable. And of course, it has to have all the right auditing processes in place to ensure that the standards you meet are correct. Now, having said that, there are certain changes and certain variations by industry sector, and some industry sectors in Australia do insist on certification by specific bodies. And part of that is because those are industry bodies that have essentially a monopoly on certification. And unfortunately, if that's the case in the sector that you're representing, you almost do not have a choice. Now, later on in the series, in fact, for the remainder of this module over the next 3 weeks, we will be looking in more detail at specific standards, and we'll be choosing the ones that are most used in Australia for the largest ones, if I could put it that way. And we will be drilling into a lot more detail around how certification works in those specific standards. So Henry, if you have a specific standard that you'd like to highlight, perhaps drop me an email, and you'll see my email address again at the end of today's presentation, and I'll make sure to get as much information as possible about that standard and its certification as I can to include over the next 3 weeks, and I'll let you know when that happens. So for SMEs, standards can help to build customer confidence that your products are safe and reliable. So if you are a producer of products, if you are a manufacturer, if you are a producer of processed foods, for example, or you manufacture goods, once you've got a certification, your customers know that those goods are safe and reliable because they know that they've essentially got the tick of approval. You will meet regulation requirements at a lower cost because many of the regulations with which you will need to comply will accept your standard certification as proof that you also meet those requirements. So you won't have to go through the process again and again and again. It will ultimately, and it can be a relatively expensive process to go through certification, but it will ultimately reduce costs across all aspects of your business. And part of that is that compliance piece that you will not need to meet again and again. We've already talked about how you will gain market access, and this is absolutely crucial if you are a smaller business. If you are a smaller business and you want to enter value and supply chains, or indeed gain market share elsewhere in the world, having a recognized standard certification will give you a competitive edge. There is no doubt about that. Now, standards have another role to play. And this speaks very much into the policy piece and whether we want to get involved in policy decision-making processes or not. As businesses, policies put in place by governments and regulators fundamentally affect the way in which we can trade internationally. And that is why understanding the role of standards in policy is really important. So standards provide a strong basis that can be applied in the development of national and international regulation. Not only do they help to save time, they're very much tools for reducing barriers to international trade because they smooth the path, so to speak. Now, standards can help policymakers to open up world trade. So, for example, ISO, IEC, and ITU have a strategic partnership with the WTO, the World Trade Organization. The WTO's agreement on technical barriers to trade recognizes the contribution that international standards make towards improving the efficiency of production and international trade and their role in the harmonization of regulations. And we'll be talking about this in some more detail later on today. Standards also stimulate solutions to national and international issues, such as disaster mitigation and recovery, efficient energy resources, and international trade. They save money by providing much of the technical detail and safety requirements needed for effective policy. So governments will very often look at the accepted standards in an industry sector and use those standards as the basis for the regulations that they put in place, assuming that if people meet the standards, they are also able to comply with the regulation. Standards also provide solutions to policy issues that might represent a wide range of views and expertise, because the understanding is that the standards have been formulated by industry, for industry, and therefore stakeholder groups buy into the standards and will therefore more readily accept the policies, understand the policies, work within the policy frameworks, and indeed be able to comply with any regulation. Standards have a very important role to play when it comes to consumers. And of course, as a business trading internationally, you are ultimately providing goods and services to consumers. You might be doing so through a larger supply chain. You might be supplying upstream to a supplier that eventually supplies the end consumer, but the end consumer should still always be front of mind for you. Consumer representatives play a very important role in the development of standards. So ISO's Committee on Consumer Policy, COPOLCO as they call it, provides resources for getting consumers involved. So consumers are actually used in the process of formulating the standards that fundamentally affect consumers. Consumers are asked to provide case studies so that those case studies can be used as use cases when it comes to formulating the standards. Consumers also can access a publicly available information area on the ISO website where the general public can get information on a range of things like technologies, for example, on the digital economy, on the ethical use of data. Now, why does that matter to you as a business? Well, it means that consumers have access to tools that make them informed consumers. Consumers know what their rights are, and they can find those rights in the standards. And if you do not comply, there's a very good chance that the consumer, instead of purchasing from you, is going to purchase from a business that does comply. Consumers also have resources from national standards bodies and regulators, and these bodies then help to engage with citizens on those standards developments. So ISO, for example, will make resources available to Standards Australia. Standards Australia can then use those resources to interact with consumers in Australia, and so every other country in the world. And there's also free access to downloadable guides that contain lots of consumer standards. Now, normally standards are, if you want the standards document, you're going to pay for it. If you are a consumer and you registered with the ISO, then you can get guides for free. It's not going to be the whole standard, but it will certainly help with those things that you need to know to make informed decisions. So again, bear in mind, your customers can be informed, usually are informed, and will hold you to a high standard. When it comes to standards development, integrating the views of the consumer is incredibly important in standards development because it does offer a real-life perspective. It helps to ensure that issues such as safety and quality are adequately addressed. And it also helps to ensure that products and services perform as expected. It improves quality and reliability, which for you as a producer of goods is really key, because it means that you can meet these quality and reliability standards. You don't have to guess at them. You can understand what the standard is and you can comply with it. It causes consistency in the delivery of services. It does give more choice and fair competition, and that is across the board. It gives transparency in production information. It ensures that products are suitable for vulnerable populations, and it also ensures that standards support consumer protection laws. So why does it matter to your business? We've already touched on this, but just to recap, consumer standards cover a whole range of issues, including the digital economy, product safety, customer satisfaction, road safety, etc. If you apply those standards, not only is it the right thing to do, it is the ethical thing to do, but it makes great marketing sense. If you have a standard that you are certified at, your potential customer immediately has a level of confidence in you that they may not have in your competitor, and that gives you a distinct marketing advantage. Now, we touched on this last week, but it is very important to understand that Standards Australia, and indeed the ISO and the IEC, Standards Australia does not regulate compliance with standards, and it does not issue certification. You will have to find a certification body to certify you under whichever standard or standards you choose to apply to your business. And when you choose somebody, you need to evaluate several certification bodies. There are almost certainly more than one in your chosen standard or standards. So have a look at them all. Look at what they charge, look at how they operate, get some reviews on whether they are good, bad, or indifferent. Just because they're accredited doesn't necessarily mean they're great. Just because they're not accredited doesn't mean they are not reputable. So evaluate them. Check if the certification body uses the relevant Casco standard, and you can look that up. Check if it is accredited. So as I said, accreditation doesn't necessarily mean that they're great, and they don't have to be accredited, but if they're accredited, it means that a certain level has already been met. To find an accredited certification body, you can go to the Standards Australia website. They have a list of them there. Or you can go to the International Accreditation Forum search site. And again, you can see the address on your screen. And I will make the deck available, as I always do, after today. If you would like a copy, you just need to send me an email and I'll send it out to you, and you'll have those two URLs. So as we know, there are literally tens of thousands of standards with which a business could comply. The ISO, as you would remember from last week, has over 24,000 standards, and then there are the IEC standards and a whole raft of others, including things like HACCP. So standards do come in all shapes and sizes. They are the distilled wisdom of people with expertise in their subject matter, people who know the needs of organizations, and these include manufacturers, sellers, buyers, trade associations, regulators, etc. There are standards for almost every aspect of your business, and that includes quality management, it includes environmental management, health and safety, energy management, food safety, IT security, and any number of others. As a business, you are going to have to assess which of the standards, in the first instance, you will need to comply with by regulation, and then you're going to have to choose the ones that you want to comply with, and those are the ones that are going to be beneficial for your business. So these are the sectors that are covered by ISO IEC standards and administered by Standards Australia. You can see there are lots of different sectors, and under each one of those main headings is then any number of subheadings, and within each of those subheadings and categories there are any number of standards. So you can get a sense of the fact that there are really many of them. So how do you choose which ones to conform with? Well, first of all, you choose your sector and the type of business. So if you're in the mining sector, for example, what do you do in the mining sector? Are you a manufacturer? Are you a service provider? Are you a consultant? Are you a miner? In other words, do you actually physically dig things out of the ground and so forth? Then you need to see what the applicable regulations are with which you need to comply. So we spent quite a bit of time last week talking about HACCP. If you're in the food processing sector, you don't have a choice. If you want to trade your goods in the food processing sector, whether it be domestically within Australia or internationally, you have to comply with HACCP. So have a look at the regulations and any standards that your industry says you have to meet before you can trade. Then, of course, there are any compliance requirements. So have a look at the compliance requirements for your industry. That could possibly include compliance that ASIC wants to see, but it could be more likely compliance that your industry wants. So there are banking regulations, for example, that include standards that have to be applied for financial service providers, etc. The next thing you have to look at is the operational aspects of your business. So what does your business actually do? Is it a manufacturing business? If it's a manufacturing business, what kind of manufacturing business is it? Is it advanced manufacturing? Is it additive manufacturing, etc.? Do you process raw materials, for example? Do you manufacture goods that are considered fast-moving consumer goods, or are they goods that are more likely to enter into supply chains and be components further upstream? And then the needs of your business. So what is it that you want to achieve by adopting a standard? Is it that you want to comply and be able to show that you comply with consumer safety requirements? Do you want to work with those upstream buyers and enter those supply chains, etc.? If what you are wanting to do is enter value chains or supply chains, you need to understand what your upstream customers require of you. They will have requirements, and we're going to be talking in a moment about multinationals. They will have requirements and they will have standards with which you will need to comply and under which you will need to be certified if they are to purchase goods from you. Of course, you need to take into account budget. Now, we've already had a question around the cost. It is expensive in many cases to comply with standards. Not in all, but certainly in the big ones, it can be expensive. There's no glossing over the fact that getting ISO 9001 certification costs. and there's a continuous cost because there is a continuous audit process to ensure that the standard is continually being met. So you need to look at the budget of your business. If you look at the list of standards and there are 5 that you think would be really good for your business to have, you might not be able to afford them all. You may only be able to afford 3 and you can add the other 2 later. So you need to kind of pick your battles. And then, of course, you also need to know whether or not you're going to seek certification. You can get the standard document. You can follow the rules within the standard. You can absolutely comply with the standard without getting an external auditor, without certification, but then you cannot claim that you comply with the standard. So just bear that in mind. If you just want to improve your business, you want to make sure that your business is doing the correct thing by way of processes, quality control, safety standards, etc., and you do not wish to claim certification, you can download by purchasing the actual standard document, and you can still go through all the process, but you cannot claim that in public unless you have gone through the certification process. So let's talk about good old-fashioned MNCs that control a lot of international trade. Multinational corporations. So a multinational corporation, quite simply, is a company that operates in its home country as well as in other countries around the world. It maintains a central office somewhere. That somewhere could be Australia, that somewhere could be the United States, or it could be the UK or Bangladesh. It then coordinates the management of all its other offices, such as administrative branches, etc., from that country. MNCs often outsource chunks of their supply and value chains to smaller organizations downstream. And you can see there 3 different types of multinational corporations. So if we look at what the characteristics are of a multinational corporation, they have very high assets and turnover. They generally have huge assets, physical and financial. They're also able to generate substantial profits. They have a network of branches, and those branches move through various countries. Some of them are branch offices, some of them are subsidiaries, etc. They generally keep growing. So if there's an Amazon, for example, as an example that we use, Amazon started as a fairly large company because it had a lot of finance behind it, but it has grown exponentially and it continues to grow. If you look at companies that provide goods, you will see similar scenarios in the trading houses, for example. There's the issue of control when it comes to multinational corporations. So the management of offices in other countries is controlled by the one head office, and very often the entire supply chain is also controlled through that head office. They usually have access to very sophisticated technology, and that means they are able to track what they do really well and to keep a very good handle on it, and that includes their suppliers. They, of course, have a lot of people, so they generally have the right skills, and they have people that have skills across multiple disciplines and multiple sectors, so they understand fundamentally what every part of their supply chain does. They also advertise a lot, and very often quite forcefully, and they usually provide to the end user good quality products. Now, when we think about those multinational corporations and all the characteristics that I've just outlined to you, what does that mean for you as a business who wants to do business with them? It means that you need to be able to prove that you are, and I use this in inverted commas, worthy of doing business with them. And that is where your standards piece absolutely comes into play. If you are certified under whichever standard is relevant to your industry, is relevant to your business, and is required by that multinational corporation, there's a much better chance that you will get a look in when they are seeking supply of the goods and the services. And bear in mind that they buy all sorts of services too, everything from professional services through to consulting services and the like. If you comply with the standards that they recognize as being necessary in the industry sector, there's a very good chance that they will do business with you rather than with a competitor of yours that does not comply. So standards are vitally important if you want to enter those global and supply chains. Now, I just want to spend a bit of time talking about the World Trade Organization and its agreement on technical barriers to trade. Short term, WTO TBT. So the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement is an agreement that is put in place to essentially ensure that technical regulations and standards and conformity assessment procedures are non-discriminatory and that they don't create unnecessary obstacles to trade. The regulation, or rather the agreement, recognizes the WTO members' rights to implement measures to achieve legitimate policy objectives, and that includes things like the protection of human health and safety and the environment. The TBT agreement strongly encourages members to base their measures on international standards as a means to facilitate trade. And the key there is that they want their members, and this is all the member states of the World Trade Organization, to use standards as the basis for any regulation that they have to facilitate trade. If you meet those standards, you are far more likely to meet the requirements of the regulation and compliance to any regulations regarding trade facilitation in the world. This agreement also creates a predictable trading environment. So again, standards used as the basis for making sure that everybody understands where they fit into the grand scheme of things. International standards can also play a key role in the harmonization of regulations. So regulations of a multitude in every country in the world. If standards are applied to them, those regulations become a lot easier to understand and they become more homogenized over different countries. So there are particularly two requirements of the WTO TBT agreement that need to be met. WTO members need to use international standards, guides, and recommendations where they exist as the basis for their technical regulations. So that is a requirement by the WTO, and members should play a full part in the preparation of international standards. So again, standards form the basis. If you meet the standard, you will almost certainly also comply with the regulation that your countries have in place. And not just Australia, but the countries into which you are exporting. So some of the things that international standards and public policy do, and you can see them there, there are legislative actions that are underpinned and also non-legislative actions. And some of those are funding priorities, which again is important because if you are looking to go into a sector that has government support, the standard will underpin that support. And this just gives you a sense of how all those technical regulations, trade policy, procurement rules, etc., play into international standards. Now, if we just cast our minds back to those multinational corporations, and we use the term MNCs because generally the big businesses do have arms in multiple countries, but it could just be a really large company in a specific country with which you want to deal. They will have specific procurement policies, and those are usually published before they do business with any business. And very often those procurement policies will also include the standards with which they expect you to comply. So you have standards that are sometimes applied by companies in order to enter their global supply chains. There are regulations that are based on standards. So again, you have to comply. And then of course, there are those standards that you have no choice in complying with if you want to trade in a specific sector. As I mentioned, over the next 3 weeks, which is the remainder of the standards module, we're going to be focusing in on some specific standards, the compliance with those standards, how you get certified, who does the certification in those different areas, and so forth. And we will be covering the major sectors. So keep an eye out for those, and make sure that if you have a specific standard that you want more information about, you bring that to my attention so that I can be sure to do the relevant research and make sure that that is included. And that brings us to the end of today's session. If you do have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box now. As I said, if it's related to a specific standard, we're not going to take that question today because we will be dealing with those as we go forward. So just make sure that you send me an email with any specifics that you have. And that is my email address. It's collinsrex@gtpalliance.com. Drop me an email, both if you would like a copy of today's deck, and also if there's a specific standard that you want more information about and you want us to include it in the next 3 sessions. If it's a really technical standard that applies to a minuscule component of the general population, we might take that one offline, because if it's not of interest to the bulk of people who are going to be tuning into these, then it probably needs some specific attention. But as I say, send it through and we'll have a look at it and we'll have a proper think about it. Now, it doesn't look as if there are any other questions. So all that remains for me to say is thank you very much for your attention. And I look forward to the pleasure of your company going forward. And hopefully over the next few weeks, we will be able to cover all manner of different things that you need as we go through this process. So thank you everyone for attending today's session, and I look forward to having you on board for the remainder of this module, and of course also for all the remaining sessions in the other 4 modules that we have as part of the Export Skills program. So thank you, have a good afternoon, and go off and do some good business. Goodbye.